If there happened to be one thing and one thing alone that I would recommend to almost every artist to start studying to improve their art, it would be learn about shapes. Shapes are extremely important because we see them almost every single day. Take, for example,
this box truck. The more we start to break down this box truck, the more we can see that it's actually just comprised of simple shapes and cylinders. The cargo hatch is going to be comprised of a big old square, and so is going to be the actual cabin for the truck. And then the wheels are obviously going to be comprised of cylinders and whatnot. And then when you start to break everything down, then you can start to fill in those details and build everything back up, because then you have the headlights, which are going to be some rhombuses and whatnot. And every little detail in this truck, it can be broken down into a simple shape. That way we're not overwhelming ourselves with the whole big picture at one time. Same for these tree branches, which are just going to be a bunch of cylinders. And when we actually add the ending shape of the cylinder, and we could see the cross contour, which when it goes across the branch, then we can start to understand the perspective at which the tree is facing, meaning that it's moving upward. And the more we add on to the details of the tree, we can start to see, oh hey, the tree is continuing to move upward and it's getting smaller, and these cylinders are doing the same exact thing, getting smaller as they get further away.
And yes, this does mean that because there are shapes in almost everything and we can use them to simplify everything to make them easier to draw, this also means that I can draw you. In all seriousness, as we've seen in the current examples that I just provided, and in the past using cylinders and spheres to construct the human body, it is easy to use shapes to construct things, right? But shapes are even more important than just that. It can come in the form of composition or the patterns that we recognize and like the folds that we have in our clothes, right?
So let's look at this piece that I did a while back for a second. We could already start to do what we did in the previous examples, which is, break things down into shapes. Like this would be for the leg, and we have the calf muscle, shin, everything else. But we're not going to do that. We've already done composition and everything else. What I want to talk about is how we see shapes in just art in general. So right here, we can off the bat see that I have a big old triangle right here. And why? Because I have 3 main focal points, or 4. The head and the hand, which is what creates this acute angle right here. The shoe, and then obviously the scythe, which is then accentuated by the sparks right here, which, adds cool factor and everything else, right? And this is important for a couple reasons. The triangle in general is just an extremely strong shape for creating good compositions because it's able to direct the viewer's eye across the entire canvas as opposed to just one small point on the canvas, right? Let's take, for example, I use a scythe here to try and generate a lot of attention from obviously the ground towards the character Callie's face. So that is one linear direction. But now I have all this dead space right up in here in this upper right corner and this bottom left corner that isn't going to any use. Which is why if I position the foot here, now I create that triangle, right? And not only does this have, just a lot more going for it in terms of you're looking at the canvas more often, what this also does is it creates an interesting pose, So when you're illustrating, you want to think about like, hey, how can I, orient a pose to maybe make a triangle shape, or I don't know what I'm doing with this to prove a point, but you get what I'm talking about, Being able to do that is going to make the character, or whatever you're drawing for that matter, just really stand out more, because we don't want things to, well, unless you're obviously going for something that looks more flat, having things broken up, having dynamic poses, having, a shoulder crossing over itself, you really start to open up various windows of both composition and making an art piece look strong and having your attention drawn across the entire canvas, right? And another thing you'll recognize more specifically about the triangle in general is that the triangle is a shape that is most often going to be used when we're creating perspective. And you can now see this in the checkered floors that are positioned down here. everything is going towards this focal point, which is positioned right around where Callie's knee is. The benefit of creating a triangle inherently creates depth within the pose itself, even if you aren't doing some extreme foreshortening like I'm doing here. And you'll find this as you start to experiment around with different poses. You'll start to see, oh hey, everything is going back towards one simple focal point, right? And when we do this, it starts to make our artwork look more appealing. It is going to start to make our artwork look more realistic or more intriguing to look at. And we're going to create a piece that is inherently just more interesting. Let's take another image, for example, and this time we're going to talk about shapes in clothing. There's different kinds of folds. I don't remember all of them, but I'll point out one right now. It's called the pipe fold. And the pipe fold essentially is as it sounds. It's like a pipe, right? And so the pipe fold, in our mind, we can paint this picture of, okay, we have this curving form. It obviously drops off on this back end, and then it comes in back towards the fabric. And then we could see this as a fact because we have our highlight in the middle of this. It starts to get darker towards the end, and obviously a harsh shadow on the backside, and then it starts to get darker as the fabric essentially does this again, right? Because if our light source is coming directly down onto the person right here, my friend, what this means is that it is then going to provide the highlight along this section, right? But the pipe fold, as it is called, forms a pipe shape. And it generally is shaped when you have one point of tension. So this could either be due to the fact that his collarbone would be located right here, or because the stitching of the hood, where it's placed and where the tension is, and it's pulling upward because he's wearing his hood upward, right? That is the pipe fold. And then you have different other folds. I forget what this one is called. I think it's called like the hook and loop fold. And it's essentially where one area of the fabric overlaps the other area. And it performs kind of this hook and loop shape, right? To me, it looks like a 9. And you can keep on repeating this and repeating this, right? And this also depends on the kinds of fabrics that you use. But the more consistently you do it, the more consistently you recognize it. And this is when you're going to be able to start drawing fabrics without reference all the time. It's not like you can do that immediately. Even I still use reference, right? But it's a point that you want to get to. And you start to recognize these shapes as you start to go into more and more examples, right? Like, I'm trying to see where another triangle would be. There are triangle specific folds. So like, say this were a pipe fold, right? And there was more tension on here. What would happen at the bottom end of this is this would also form a triangle, right? So there would be more shading, but there's not a lot of tension created by his shoulder here. Here in another old example of an artwork that I did, you can start to see more shapes start to appear, like a triangle once again. And what would you guess? The triangle happens when you have 2 points of tension. So for Ina right here, the fabric is draping off of her shoulder and then off of her breast, right? So it is starting to form that triangular shape, and then it only repeats itself, this time just a little bit more oblong, because it's still following from the same piece of fabric at the same tension points. The fabric is just starting to expand. And again, you'll start to notice these shapes as you're using reference, and I can even drop down a link for a video below which will talk about fabric shapes and folds. But in a general sense, the shapes are everywhere, not just in, you know, the shape of the character, you know, with like the Loomis head and everything else, but the shapes really will start to form in every single thing that you draw. And you'll start to see that, and the more you begin to recognize it, it'll make it easier for you to construct your own illustrations. Let's take for another example, these deer right here. We can obviously see triangle shape, right? And that's the first thing you could easily point out. But the other fact is that we know that their horizon line is already going to be somewhere back here. There's just a couple ways to tell that the horizon line is as shot from above, but namely it's going to be like the perspective of the deer's head, right? This ear is a little bit lower, meaning that the ear is going backwards and whatnot. Because none of these deers are actually giving us a front-facing view to say like, hey, yeah, the deer is, you know, as seen from above, but we can use those little cues. It's easy to spot in photography because you kind of understand the perspective immediately as opposed to, you know, trying to draw it yourself. But let's look at some other facts. So let's just assume that this is a horizon line back here. Everything is coming towards this direction. Now each of these deer is resting on its own portion of the landscape. And this provides depth, you know? So if everything is shot from the horizon line above, then you have this deer, this deer, this deer. And yeah, this deer could be a little bit larger back here, but we still get the sense that, oh, this deer is the furthest from the camera in comparison to these two, right? That's because of where it sits on the landscape. And our reference from the horizon line to actually being able to see it to the direction that the deer are facing and using this triangle, we then begin to understand like, oh, there is perspective happening here. You know, this deer is obviously, if we look at the lengths of these, closer. This one right here, closer to the horizon line than this one is, which easily gives us a sense of perspective when we start to, again, recognize those patterns as we see artwork and we see other compositions. As a final example, here I have an illustration I did of Kikuri. Now, there's something that a lot of, especially early artists, they fail to recognize when they're developing illustrations, and that is using negative space to your advantage. Now, what is negative space? Negative space is just the space behind the main subject that you're illustrating. And so again, we can see this. This isn't a video about triangles, by the way, but triangles are just, they're a life hack to wanting to create, you know, good illustrations. We have a triangle right here. Triangle right here, right? And what does this do? This allows us to see the arch in Hikuri's back. This allows us to see the dynamicism of her pose, because if the, let's say the arm were to cover everything, and I'm just going to use just her skin tone just to sort of create an idea, right? Suddenly everything in this section, it looks bulky, right? Because her shoulder is going to end right around here, but for whatever reason it looks bulky, even though we know Kikuri as a character is actually extremely slender, right? So what's going on? Being able to take, you know, an arm or a limb or a weapon or an object, a prop, and use it to create a dynamicism between the character. It gives you an excuse to make the pose more dynamic. Say they're throwing a spear or pulling back a bow, right? Or holding a guitar. It gives you more excuses to make a dynamic pose, of course, but what it also does is it shows the rest of the torso, and showing the torso is only going to add more to the idea of, hey, this character is moving a certain way, or hey, this character acts a certain way, right? And we can see even more dead space, even more dead space. And this also helps supplement the perspective. This is also going to make the character pop more and separate them from the background or the foreground or anything else, because now we have more space around the character, which then we could say like, hey, this is a chair and this is a character. Because what happens sometimes is they'll blend their values, or what happens is they might be using similar values in an awkward lighting, and if it starts to blend and they don't have anything behind it that can, you know, potentially cast a shadow, what happens is the character will start to blend with the background. And I know, especially for amateur artists, you could say that you've probably done this before. I know I definitely have. So orienting the limbs, orienting props and everything else, you'll start to recognize that it will create shapes. And those shapes will, again, help you to start to understand the composition and everything else. And while we're here, we might as well take note of certain aspects of this composition. This leg in the foreground is starting to go up towards this hand, which was like a little Easter egg. You know, if you watch Bocchi the Rock, you know Ryo Yamada. And then the guitar, obviously right here, it's centralized between this leg and the hand. This could either go back towards the shoulder, but let's just use the elbow because it's frontward of the composition, right? Elbow goes back to, we have a barcode right here, we have the stem of the guitar, we have a lot of things for the viewer to look at within this general direction, right? And that's what you're going for. And there's of course going to be other aspects of this illustration, which then the illustrator or the viewer can then decide, hey, I want to look this direction, or hey, I want to look that direction. And it's keeping that intrigue of the viewer, which makes the illustration look nice. Because the easiest one is going to be starting back at the knee again, going all the way into the guitar strap, pulling Kikuri's hair, and then going back to her face, right? And having these two little Easter eggs right here helps. Having her, I believe this is called the waki, helps. Having this another Easter egg right here helps. You know, so it's really just being decisive about where you're placing certain things on the canvas and creating those shapes to enhance that composition, but it's also recognizing the shapes that you see within the composition to support your pose or to support the realism of the pose. Again, going back to clothing too, we could see the triangle shapes, the tension points, because the tension is falling around from, this is a looser dress and it's falling around from below where her breast would be on the sides of her body and going down towards the center line of her torso, right? Falling down, going backwards, going towards the crotch again. Everything is following triangles and similar shapes just because that's how we familiarize ourselves with the shapes that we see around us. And to throw in just one more example, I'm going to show you this. You go over to tonal correction in Clip Studio anyways, and you use the binarization filter. You can then use that to block out everything into a black and white, and then it'll try and, you know, hunt those values in between, right? This is the final thing that you might see when you're illustrating, and it is using shapes and shading. Artists like Dino Art for Ame, or Dino Ellis, now as he goes by, will use this a lot. And he'll do this mainly because when he does his shading, he'll cut out with a multiply layer the shaded area, and he'll use a lasso tool, and that makes it really easy for him. But when you start to recognize the way light will commonly fall into something, especially from like an upwards angle, you'll start to note, oh, this creates this rhombus shape for the nose, right? And then the face has these rectangles right here, right? And everything, all those little bits in between, you start to recognize those things. You'll start to recognize how it falls down onto the elbow, back onto the forearm, right? And even the minute details, which is where a lot of people get hung up, which is going to be how light falls onto the hair, because you might have some hairs that are sticking out into where the light is coming down from, and or you might have some hairs that are rounding back into the head, right, forming this hoop shape. Or for those hairs that are sticking out, you could see a little bit more of them at a distance. Other things, like for the shape of the hand, you have that. And obviously this value for the mouth is different just because teeth are a much lighter color, but you start to see those shapes as you go about with your illustration. And when you're looking at other illustrations from other artists or photographic works, then you'll start to recognize the shapes that you see when doing details like the hair, and when cutting it out with the lasso tool, or when illustrating the face, and you start to see how light falls onto the face. You know, if you have like a 3/4 view, like so, this is a pretty common one, which is you might have a 3/4 view like this, and then light is coming in here. There's a little section under the eye that gets lit up just past the bridge of the nose, and you'll start to see that. And then the rest of the face might be darkened on this half, right? But then you have this half, which is lit up. And then because the socket goes inward right here, this same exact section on the other side might actually be darker, right? So it's those little idiosyncrasies and shapes like that where the more you start to recognize it and the more you start to allow yourself to see it in different art, the more you're able to apply it without reference, and or you just simply know what you're doing. It's going to make your illustrations and your process a whole lot easier, especially if you study it. So I highly recommend that you do.
All right, so that is all I have for today. Okay, I know it's been a while since I've made a video last, and I have so many video ideas. It's just finding the consistency and time to actually do something is just difficult, but I'm trying to get back into my groove. I have definitely improved as an artist over the last year, and I can thank y'all for that. Y'all have given me amazing opportunities, and I appreciate not just teaching, but learning, right? If you have any questions, please drop them down in the comments below. That is exactly what I'm here for. If I can answer them, then I gladly will. Otherwise, appreciate you. Don't stop learning. And trust me, she's purring. She loves this. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye-bye.